In the spring of 1991, a soil scientist from Purdue University Extension came to the Voss farm in Cass County, Indiana, dug 47 soil profile holes across 280 acres, and produced a map that explained something Leonard Voss had been wondering about for 3 years. It explained why his grandfather Otto had never tiled the bottom field. Leonard had wondered about this since he took over the farm from his father in 1988. The bottom field, 30 acres at the low north end of the property where the ground fell away toward the creek drainage, was the one untiled piece of the operation. Every other wet area on the farm had been addressed over 40 years. Clay tile in the 1960s under Otto, plastic corrugated extensions in the 1980s under Leonard's father. 250 acres properly drained. 30 acres left exactly as the creek had left them when it changed course sometime in the 1800s. Dark and wet and slow to dry in the spring, and inexplicably productive in the dry Augusts when everything else on the farm was showing stress. Dale Ferris, who had sold Leonard's father 2 drainage installations and who called on Leonard every spring with his design book and his tape measure, had been telling Leonard for 3 years that the bottom field was leaving money on the table. $200 an acre at current yield differentials, Dale said, between well-drained and poorly drained ground in Cass County. 30 acres at $200 was $6,000 a year Leonard was not capturing. $6,000 a year. Leonard had thought about that number. He had thought about it while looking at the bottom field in April, standing knee-deep in the knowledge that this ground would not see a planter until May, while his drained fields were ready in the 3rd week of April. He had thought about it in June, when the dark, wet soil finally dried and the corn came up late and uneven at the field margins. He had thought about it every time and not tiled it, not because he had decided it was a good idea to leave it, because his grandfather Otto had not tiled it, and Otto had farmed this same ground for 26 years, and Leonard could not find a record anywhere of Otto having said why. The bottom field knows what it is, Otto had told Leonard's father once. Leave what works alone. That was the explanation. That was all of it. Leonard had asked his father whether there was more to it than that. His father had said, with your grandfather, that was usually all there was. The soil scientist's map arrived in June of 1991. Leonard spread it on the kitchen table. He looked at the profile data for the bottom field. The scientist had dug 6 holes across those 30 acres. The color key on the map showed the bottom field in a designation the legend called Kokomo silty clay loam, a soil type characterized by a subsoil clay pan at 14 to 22 inches depth, high shrink-swell capacity, very slow permeability, and a specific water-holding characteristic that the scientist's notes described in language Leonard had to read twice to understand fully. He called the soil scientist that afternoon. The clay pan, Leonard said. What does it do in a drought year? The scientist said, it acts as a reservoir, and the clay holds water at the subsoil level, even when the surface has dried down. Deep-rooted corn can access that stored water in July and August, when shallow-rooted plants in well-drained soils have used their profile moisture and are in stress. Leonard said, what happens if you tile through it? The scientist was quiet for a moment. He said, you drain it. The clay pan loses its water-holding capacity because the tile creates a lower water table below the pan. You get better spring drainage. You lose the summer reservoir. Leonard looked at the map. He looked at the bottom field soil type. He said, "My grandfather never tiled this field." The scientist said, "He may have known something about it. Was he a careful observer?" Leonard thought about Otto crouching at the field edge with both hands in the soil, looking at the distance. He said he was. Let me tell you about Otto Voss, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he saw in that field. Otto had come to Cass County from northern Indiana in 1948 when he bought the farm at a bank auction for $14,200, a price that reflected the fact that the farm had been poorly managed through the war years and had standing drainage problems that the previous owner had neither the capital nor the inclination to address. Otto had capital. He had saved for 7 years working at a machine shop in South Bend while he waited for the right farm at the right price. He had also, over those 7 years, spent his weekends reading every soil science publication he could find at the public library and the extension office and the county agricultural agent's reading room. He was not a formally educated man. He had finished 8th grade, but he had a machinist's eye for how systems worked, and he applied that eye to soil the same way he applied it to a gear train, reading the inputs and outputs, understanding what the system was designed to do, identifying where it was working correctly and where it was not. When he walked the 280 acres he was buying, he walked the bottom field last and longest. He pushed a steel rod into the soil at 12 different points across the 30 acres. He noted the depth at which the rod slowed. The clay pan, though he did not have that vocabulary yet, and he felt the resistance pattern across the field and thought about what it meant. He bought the farm. He tiled the wet areas that needed tiling, the north headland of the upper field, the low corner of the middle field, or the seep area along the east fence line. He did not tile the bottom field. His neighbor to the west, a man named Harlan Graves, asked him about it in the spring of 1949 when the bottom field was standing in water 3 weeks after everything around it had dried. "Otto," Harlan said, "why aren't you tiling the low ground? That field is going to cost you a month of planting every year." Otto looked at the field. He said, "It costs me a month in spring." He paused. "I want to see what it gives me in August before I decide what to do about it." Harlan looked at him. "What do you mean, what it gives you in August?" Otto said, "Every field that holds too much water in spring holds more than the sandy fields in summer." He looked at Harlan. "I want to know how much more before I drain it." He paused. "Draining costs money, but drained ground cannot be undrained." That was the sentence. Drained ground cannot be undrained. Otto waited 1 full growing season before making any decision about the bottom field. In the summer of 1949, July went dry. Cass County went 8 weeks without a meaningful rain. Otto's drained fields began to show stress in the 4th week. His neighbor's drained fields showed stress at the same time, because drainage is drainage. It removes excess water equally in wet years and dry. The bottom field did not show stress. The corn in the bottom field, planted late, emerged unevenly at the margins, stood dark green through the 5th week of the dry spell, while the fields around it were beginning to fire from the bottom of the leaf. Otto walked the field in August of 1949 with a pocket knife. He cut a stalk at the base and looked at the moisture in the cross-section. He cut stalks in the drained field adjacent and looked at those. The bottom field stalks were fully turgid. The drained field stalks were beginning to desiccate. He walked to the fence line. Harlan Graves was looking at his own corn across the road, which was beginning to show the gray-green of drought stress. "Harlan," Otto said, "come look at this." Harlan came over. He looked at the bottom field corn. He looked at his own field. He said, "What's holding it?" Otto put his boot heel into the soil at the field margin. It sank 2 inches. He said, "The subsoil is still wet." He looked at Harlan. "This ground holds water below the surface through August." He paused. "That is what I wanted to know." He never tiled it, not in 26 years of farming it. He planted it late every spring and accepted the late emergence and the uneven stand at the margins, and he harvested it in the fall, knowing that it had outperformed his drained ground in every dry July and August he had farmed through. How many dry Julys and Augusts in 26 years? Otto kept no formal records, but Leonard had heard the number from his father. 4 bad droughts in the period Otto farmed, 1953, 1963, 1970, and 1974. In each of those years, the bottom field outperformed the drained ground by margins that his father estimated, from memory, at 20 to 40 bushels per acre. In the wet years, it underperformed. In the normal years, it ran close to even. Leonard had done the arithmetic after the soil scientist's call. He pulled out his pocket notebook and worked through it. Over the 26 years Otto farmed, 4 drought years at an average of 30 bushels per acre advantage on 30 acres. That was 3,600 additional bushels across 4 years. At the corn prices of those eras, roughly $1.20 to $1.80 per bushel. That was between $4,320 and $6,480. Otto had captured from that field that his neighbor, Harlan Graves, who had tiled his equivalent low ground in 1952, had not. Against that, the cost of tile installation on 30 acres in current dollars would run approximately $4,800. The yield drag in wet years, when the bottom field ran late and uneven, cost perhaps 15 bushels per acre per wet year. In 26 years, with maybe 8 significantly wet springs, that was 3,600 bushels lost, roughly the same number as the drought year gain. The field approximately broke even against a tiled alternative over the full span, but breaking even was not the point. The point was that drained ground cannot be undrained. The point was that Otto had kept an option open that cost him the same as it gave him in normal conditions and gave him substantially more than it cost in the years when it mattered most. Let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever kept something that cost you nothing in most years, but you could not put a value on in the specific year that it mattered? Have you ever watched someone make a change to ground, to equipment, to a system that had always worked one way, and understood too late that the change eliminated an option they could not get back? Dale Ferris had been right that the bottom field was leaving money on the table in wet years. What he had not calculated was what money it was putting on the table in the dry ones. That calculation required knowing the soil at 14 to 22 inches depth, which required either a soil map or 26 years of watching the same field through every kind of year Indiana weather could produce. Otto had the 26 years. Leonard had the soil map. Now let me tell you about what Leonard did with the map. He called Dale Ferris the day after he talked to the soil scientist. "Dale," he said, when Dale answered, "I got the soil map." "Good," Dale said. "What did it show?" Leonard said, "The bottom field has a clay pan at 18 inches. Kokomo silty clay loam." "Dale, if I tile through that pan, I drain it in spring, and I lose the summer reservoir." Dale was quiet. Then he said, "The water-holding capacity, that's right." Dale was quiet again for longer. He had sold 42 tile systems in Cass County. He had never had someone call him with a soil profile that suggested tiling was the wrong answer. He was a fair man, though. He looked at his design book on the passenger seat. He looked at his tape measure on the belt. He said, "Leonard, your grandfather didn't tile it." "That's right. Did he tell you why?" Leonard said, "He said the field knows what it is." He paused. He said, "Leave what works alone." Dale was quiet. Then he said, "Your grandfather was right." That was the end of the conversation. Dale drove past the Voss farm that spring without stopping. Let me tell you about August of 1991, because that is where the number becomes concrete. The summer of 1991 was the driest summer in Cass County since 1970. July brought 11/100ths of an inch of rain across the entire month. The corn in well-drained fields across the county began to roll, the leaves curling inward on themselves to reduce transpiration, the plant's specific distress signal that the root zone moisture is running out. The Extension Office issued a drought advisory on July 22nd. The crop insurance adjusters began moving through the county in the first week of August. Leonard's drained fields rolled on July 19th. He had good hybrids, good populations, good fertilization. The drained ground had been productive all spring and would be productive again after the drought broke. But July was dry, and the profile moisture was depleted, and the plants were telling him so through their leaves. The bottom field did not roll, not in July, not in the first week of August. The corn in the bottom field stood dark and upright, while the fields around it curled and grayed, and the leaves of the drained field corn showed the yellow-green shade of a plant beginning to mine its own tissue for nutrients, because it cannot get them from the dry soil. Leonard walked the bottom field on August 3rd. He pushed his boot heel into the soil and felt what Otto had felt in August of 1949. The surface was dry. An inch below the surface it was damp. At the clay pan level, a foot and a half down, where the subsoil changed character and held rather than drained, the soil was wet. The stored water from the spring and early summer had not moved. The clay pan had held it. The corn roots that had grown down into and against the pan were finding moisture that did not exist anywhere else on the farm. Dale Ferris came by on August 5th, not to sell tile, just to look. He parked at the field edge and got out of his truck and stood at the fence line looking at the bottom field corn, standing dark and straight against the background of rolled corn, visible in every surrounding field. Leonard came out to the lane. They stood at the fence line together for a moment. Dale said, "What is it running at?" Leonard looked at the corn. He said, "I walked it this morning. I think it is going to come in around 160 bushels." He paused. "The drained ground north of it is going to be 90 to 100 if this breaks soon, maybe less if it doesn't." Dale nodded. He looked at the field. He said, "How many dry summers in the last 10 years?" Leonard thought. He said, 3 significant ones, '83, '88, and this one. Dale said, in those 3 years, well, what did the bottom field do compared to the drained ground? Leonard said, in '83 I wasn't farming yet. In '88 I was in the first year. He paused. The bottom field ran maybe 30 bushels ahead of the drained north field in '88. He looked at Dale. I know because I kept records that year. He pulled the spiral notebook from his bib pocket. I wrote it down. Dale looked at the notebook. He looked at the field. He said, you know what your grandfather knew without the soil map. Leonard said, I had the soil map. He paused. He had 26 years. Dale shook his head slowly. He looked at his truck. He looked at his tape measure on his belt. He said, I have sold 42 tile systems in this county. This is the first time the right answer was, don't tile. He paused. I should have known this from the start. If I had asked about the August performance before I talked about the spring performance, I would have seen it. Leonard was quiet. Dale said, what did the drainage on those 42 farms cost their August yields in dry years? Leonard did not answer. It was not a question that had an easy answer, and Dale was not asking for one. He was doing the calculation himself, standing at the fence line in August of 1991, and the calculation was not small. He said, I am going to start asking about August before I talk about April. He turned and walked back to his truck. Then he stopped. He said, your grandfather, did he know about the clay pan specifically, the soil science of it? Leonard thought about it. He said, I don't think he had the vocabulary. He had the observation. Dale nodded. He got in his truck. He drove down the county road. Let me tell you about the years after, because this story has 2 more things to say. The 1991 bottom field corn came in at 157 bushels per acre. The drained north field came in at 94. The difference was 63 bushels per acre across 30 acres, which was 1,890 additional bushels. At $2.40 per bushel that fall, Leonard had $4,536 more from the bottom field than from an equivalent acreage of drained ground. In that single year, the bottom field paid back in full the estimated cost of the tile installation it had never received. Leonard wrote that number in his spiral notebook. He wrote, August 1991, bottom field 157, north 94. Difference, 63 bushels per acre, net, $4,536. He wrote under it. Grandfather was right. He wrote under that. The field knows what it is. Dale Ferris changed his sales process after 1991. He started asking about August performance data before he produced a drainage design. He started requesting soil profile information for fields with drainage issues before he recommended tile depth and spacing. He sold 7 fewer systems in Cass County over the following 3 years than he had sold in the 3 years before. He said in an interview with the County Farm Bureau newsletter in 1993, I was solving a spring problem without asking about the summer. Some wet fields are wet because they are in the wrong place. Some are wet because they are doing something the drainage map doesn't show. The article quoted him by name. Leonard read it at the kitchen table and kept it in his notebook with the yield records. The bottom field is still untiled. Leonard's son farms it now, the 4th generation on the same ground. He has the soil map on the wall of the machine shed, the one the Purdue scientists produced in 1991 framed because Leonard framed it the same week he got it and never moved it. The clay pan is at 18 inches. It has been at 18 inches since before anyone in the family was born. It will be at 18 inches when the last person in the family farms it. In wet springs, the field is the last one planted. In dry Augusts, it is the best field on the farm. It knows what it is. Subscribe to The Honest Farmer for more stories like this one. Stories of the fields that work in ways nobody understood until the map arrived, and the men who left them alone long enough for the map to confirm what they already knew. Of the drainage contractor who changed his sales process after one August at a fence line. Of the observations that run ahead of the science, arriving 40 years early, expressed in words that do not fully translate. The field knows what it is until the vocabulary finally catches up. Hit the bell so you do not miss the next one. Tell me in the comments. Did your family have ground that everyone said should be drained or leveled or tiled, that your grandfather or father left alone for reasons they could not fully explain? Otto Voss crouched in the bottom field in August of 1949 and felt the moisture in the soil at the clay pan depth and decided not to drain a field that did not need draining. He did not have the Purdue soil map. He did not have the Kokomo silty clay loam designation. He did not have the vocabulary of shrink swell capacity or subsoil permeability or residual profile moisture. He had his boot heel and 47 years of paying attention and the specific patience of a man who knew that drained ground cannot be undrained and that some questions are worth taking a whole growing season to answer before you do the irreversible thing. The soil map said, clay pan at 18 inches, high water holding capacity, not recommended for tile drainage. Otto said, leave what works alone. They were saying the same thing. One of them had a map. The other had the ground itself.